He cut 14 ounces off his rifle and became unstoppable. Then the same weapon went silent for 78 straight days. Second Lieutenant John George did not look like a revolutionary. He was a competitive marksman from Illinois, trained on ranges where precision mattered more than speed. On Guadalcanal in 1943, that background became lethal. Japanese snipers occupied fixed positions in trees and bunkers, relying on concealment and patience. George hunted them the way he had hunted targets in competition: slow, deliberate, exact. In 4 days, with 12 shots, 11 enemy snipers were dead. What made his rifle different was not its power, but its weight. George removed the traditional walnut stock from his Winchester Model 70 and replaced it with an experimental synthetic version. The change saved 14 ounces. On paper, the difference looked trivial. In combat, it meant less fatigue, steadier aim, and faster recovery after each shot. Officers mocked the rifle as a civilian sporting toy, but the results ended the argument. By the time George was reassigned to Merrill's Marauders in early 1944, the Winchester had become part of his identity. It symbolized precision, control, and the idea that one disciplined marksman could shape a fight. What no one yet understood was that Guadalcanal had rewarded a very specific kind of war, and Burma would punish it. Burma erased everything that had made the Winchester successful. The jungle offered no fixed targets, no clear sight lines, no patience. Combat happened at 30 to 50 yards, not 300. Patrols collided, exchanged fire for seconds, then vanished into the trees. Survival depended on movement and volume, not stillness and precision. George carried the lightened rifle for weeks without firing a single shot. Every night he cleaned it, oiled it, protected it from rain and rot, but it remained strapped to his pack during fights. When contact came, there was no time to lie prone, range a target, adjust windage, and squeeze a careful trigger. Men with M1 Garands fired semi-automatic volleys and broke contact before Japanese counterattacks arrived. The weight George had saved now meant nothing. 14 ounces did not compensate for a bolt-action rifle in a war where firepower decided who could move and who would be pinned. The Winchester had been optimized for a battlefield that no longer existed. In Burma's mobile war, reputation was dead weight, and precision without opportunity was useless. When the Winchester finally fired in Burma, it proved the problem instantly. From a ridge overlooking the Tawny River, George spotted a Japanese officer organizing a crossing more than 400 yards away. It was the kind of target his rifle had been built for. One shot, one kill. The enemy scattered, the crossing collapsed, and the mission succeeded. But the cost was immediate. The rifle's deep, distinctive report echoed across the valley, nothing like the sharp cracks of M1 Garands. Friendly troops thought an American weapon had been captured. Worse, the platoon's position was compromised. 30 men had to move 2 miles through trackless jungle to avoid retaliation. One precision shot had bought success, but at the price of time, exhaustion, and exposure. In later fights, the pattern repeated. Against a Japanese machine gun at long range, the Winchester silenced the position with a single round. Yet again, confusion followed. Again, the bolt-action's slow rate of fire and unique sound created problems in a chaotic fight. The rifle still worked. The war around it no longer did. By the time Modification fell, the numbers told the truth. The Winchester, that had killed 11 men in 4 days on Guadalcanal, had fired only 3 times in 78 days in Burma. George survived not because of marksmanship, but because volume of fire, speed, and teamwork kept his platoon alive. The M1, Garand, imperfect, heavy, and unromantic, had carried the war forward. After evacuation and recovery, George wrote honestly about the experience. The rifle had not become worse. The war had changed. Static positions had given way to movement. Individual skill had been replaced by coordinated fire. Precision was no longer enough. The stock trick had worked exactly once, in exactly the right conditions. Burma proved the final lesson. No weapon is universal. no advantage permanent. In modern war, adaptation matters more than excellence, and the battlefield always decides which skills survive. John George's experience is uncomfortable because it attacks a belief that feels instinctively true, that mastery, once earned, should always matter. On Guadalcanal, mastery mattered completely. Terrain, tempo, and enemy behavior aligned perfectly with the skill of a single marksman. Static positions rewarded patience. Clear sight lines rewarded optics. Fixed enemy habits rewarded pattern recognition. In that environment, the Winchester Model 70 was not just a rifle, it was a force multiplier that turned one man into an asymmetric threat. 11 kills in 4 days was not luck, it was alignment. Burma broke that alignment. The jungle did not care how accurate George was. It did not care how light his rifle had become, how carefully he had tuned eye relief, or how many competitions he had won before the war. Burma rewarded different traits entirely. Endurance over finesse, volume over precision, adaptability over specialization. Warfare, there was not a contest of marksmanship, but a test of organizational stamina. Who could move faster? Who could recover faster? Who could maintain pressure longer with fewer resources? This is where the story becomes larger than one man or one rifle. The Winchester did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was optimized for a world that no longer existed. 14 ounces of weight savings meant nothing when the problem was not fatigue, but opportunity. A rifle cannot fire if the war never pauses long enough to aim. George's silence across 78 days is more revealing than his kills. It shows how modern conflict increasingly denies specialists the conditions they require. Precision demands time. Time is the first casualty of mobile warfare. In Burma, engagements happened inside decision loops, too fast for bolt-action logic. Contact, fire, movement, withdrawal. Miss one step, and you died. The Garand's value was not accuracy per round, but relevance per second. There is also a psychological cost hidden inside the numbers. Each time George fired the Winchester, he paid in disruption. The distinctive sound created confusion among friendly troops. The single-shot signature exposed positions that could not be abandoned quickly. Precision was no longer discreet, it was loud in a system designed around collective noise. What once made him invisible now made him conspicuous. This is the moment where the romantic idea of the lone expert collapses. Guadalcanal rewarded individual excellence because the battlefield allowed it. Burma punished it because the battlefield could not absorb it. Modern war does not eliminate skill. It subsumes it. Skill must serve tempo, not override it. The final patrol near Modification crystallizes the lesson brutally. George does everything right. He reads terrain, identifies the threat, makes the shot, and saves lives. Then the bill comes due. 1 round left, deep in enemy territory. When combat collapses into close-range chaos, the rifle becomes dead weight. The pistol, crude and inefficient, suddenly matters more, not because it is better, but because it is present when needed. This is the quiet truth of adaptation. The best tool is the one that still functions inside chaos. After the war, George did not cling to nostalgia. He did not argue that Burma was an exception or that the rifle deserved more chances. He accepted what the data showed. 3 shots in 3 months. The Garand fired dozens. One weapon shaped memory. The other shaped survival. His teaching reflected that honesty. He trained officers for wars as they were becoming, not wars as he wished them to be. The deeper lesson is not about rifles. It is about context dominance. Excellence is always conditional. A skill that defines you in one environment can betray you in another if you refuse to reassess its relevance. The Winchester was not obsolete because it stopped killing. It was obsolete because the system around it no longer allowed killing to matter in the same way. Burma represents the transition point where warfare crossed a threshold. Industrial scale, logistical attrition, disease, movement, and coordination outweighed individual brilliance. This does not diminish George's achievement on Guadalcanal. It frames it. His success was real, and so was its expiration date. The danger lies in mistaking past performance for permanent truth. George did not make that mistake. He adapted intellectually, even when the rifle could not. That is why his story endures. Not because of how many he killed, but because he recognized when killing stopped being the central metric. In the end, the Winchester sits in a museum, not as a relic of failure, but as evidence of transition. It marks the boundary between two kinds of war. One where craftsmen could dominate moments, another where systems dominated outcomes. George lived through that boundary and understood it from both sides. That understanding is the real weapon he carried home. What makes George's story difficult to accept is that it removes comfort from experience itself. We want war and life to reward accumulated skill indefinitely. We want the rules to stay stable long enough for mastery to remain decisive. Burma proves that stability is an illusion. Environments evolve faster than people do, and systems adapt faster than individuals. On Guadalcanal, George's rifle compressed decision-making into a single moment. See, breathe, fire. One man closed a loop faster than the enemy could respond. Burma expanded that loop beyond individual control. Decisions were no longer isolated. They were collective, sequential, and constrained by movement, health, and logistics. A single perfect action could no longer dominate a chain of imperfect conditions. This is why the stock trick feels almost tragic. It represents optimization without redefinition. George made the rifle lighter, not different. He refined a tool instead of questioning whether the tool still belonged in the system. The adjustment worked, just not where it mattered anymore. 14 ounces solved a marching problem, not a warfare problem. Modern conflict punishes that kind of thinking relentlessly. Once war becomes continuous rather than episodic, tools designed for moments lose ground to tools designed for persistence. The Garand was not superior because it killed more efficiently. It was superior because it remained relevant when conditions collapsed into noise, fear, and speed. It functioned when plans failed. There is a lesson here about feedback. Guadalcanal gave George immediate reinforcement. He fired, he killed, the method validated itself. Burma delayed feedback so long that the method quietly died. Weeks passed without engagement, then months. The absence of failure felt like patience. In reality, it was obsolescence waiting to be revealed. This is how outdated systems survive longer than they should. They do not fail loudly. They fail by not being called upon. When George finally used the Winchester again, it worked just well enough to hide the deeper truth. Each success masked the accumulating costs. Time lost, movement forced, ammunition scarcity, cognitive friction among friendly forces. The weapon still performed tactically, but it failed operationally. And operational failure is what decides wars. The transition from individual dominance to system dominance is not unique to firearms. It appears everywhere industrial scale intrudes. Air combat moved from dogfights to formations. Naval combat moved from gunnery duels to radar and carrier groups. Infantry followed the same arc. Once warfare becomes an exercise in sustained pressure, the unit replaces the hero. George's genius was not that he mastered the rifle, it was that he accepted this transition without bitterness. He did not romanticize his earlier success or treat Burma as a personal injustice. He treated it as data. That mindset is rare. Most people defend the skills that made them valuable once, even as reality erodes their relevance. This is why his post-war teaching mattered more than his wartime kills. He trained officers to think in terms of fire distribution, tempo control, and collective survivability. He taught them not how to win moments, but how to survive systems. That intellectual shift saved lives long after the Winchester stopped firing. The rifle's final place in a museum is appropriate, but not for the usual reason. It is not there to celebrate craftsmanship or nostalgia. It is there as a boundary marker. It shows where one logic of war ended and another began. Visitors see wood, steel, and optics. What they miss is the lesson embedded inside it, that adaptation is not optional, and excellence expires faster than we expect. Burma did not humiliate the Winchester. It contextualized it. The jungle forced a reckoning between what worked before and what worked now. George passed that test. The rifle did not and could not. In the end, the most dangerous belief in war is not overconfidence. It is continuity, the assumption that yesterday's answers will remain correct tomorrow. George survived because he learned when to let go of that belief. The stock trick bought him victories. Letting go of it bought him understanding. That is why this story endures. Not because of how lethal one man was, but because of how honestly he confronted the moment his edge disappeared. There is one final implication that pushes this story beyond war and into something universal. George's experience exposes a truth about progress that people resist acknowledging. Improvement is not linear, and advantage is not cumulative. The world does not stack your strengths neatly and reward you forever. It reshuffles the board without asking whether you are ready. On Guadalcanal, George's strength was decisive because the system bent around him. In Burma, the system bent around nothing and no one. That shift is the moment when merit becomes conditional. It is also the moment when many people fail not because they lack ability, but because they refuse to renegotiate their identity. The Winchester was more than a weapon. It was proof. Proof that George's discipline mattered. Proof that preparation paid off. Proof that he was exceptional. Carrying it through Burma meant carrying that proof even as reality quietly invalidated it. That tension is brutal. Letting go of a tool often means letting go of a story about yourself. Most people don't. They double down. They demand conditions return. They blame leadership, luck, or circumstance. George didn't. He observed. He measured. He accepted. That acceptance is rare, and it is why his legacy survived longer than the rifle's relevance. This is why Burma feels harsher than Guadalcanal despite fewer shots fired. Guadalcanal tested skill. Burma tested ego. One rewards mastery. The other demands humility. Only one of those lessons scales. The battlefield did not need George to be perfect. It needed him to be useful. That distinction is everything. Perfection is fragile. Usefulness is resilient. Modern systems, whether military, industrial, or social, select for the latter with ruthless consistency, and that is the quiet irony at the heart of the story. The Winchester killed men. George's understanding saved them. The rifle's journey from dominance to obsolescence was not a failure of engineering. It was evidence of acceleration. Warfare moved faster than specialization could keep up. The same is true in every competitive system. Skills decay not because they are wrong, but because the environment outgrows them. This is why the story resonates beyond history. Everyone eventually carries a Winchester into a Burma of their own, a method that once worked perfectly, a strength that once defined them, a trick that earned respect. Then one day, without ceremony, it stops being called upon. The danger is mistaking silence for relevance. George listened to the silence. He did not confuse it with patience or waiting his turn. He understood it as signal. That awareness, more than marksmanship, more than innovation, is the rarest skill of all. The Winchester rests in a museum now, framed as an artifact. But its real value is not what it did. It is what it revealed, that no advantage is permanent, no expertise immune, and no victory transferable without adaptation. The stock trick was clever. The acceptance of its limits was wisdom. That is why this story endures. Not because it celebrates a weapon, but because it documents the exact moment when mastery met reality and chose to evolve instead of pretending nothing had changed. There is a reason this kind of lesson only appears in hindsight. In the moment, adaptation feels like betrayal of training, of identity, of everything that once justified the effort it took to become good. George did not simply switch weapons. He abandoned a worldview. He accepted that what had made him exceptional was no longer the axis around which survival rotated. That acceptance is harder than learning any technical skill. Training teaches you how to improve inside a framework. Experience teaches you when the framework itself is obsolete. Burma forced that reckoning daily. Marches did not care about kill counts. Disease did not care about precision. Success became statistical rather than heroic. How many men reached the next phase alive? How many could still carry rifles? How many could still think clearly? In that math, the Winchester's elegance was irrelevant. What mattered was whether a unit could keep moving under pressure. This is the point where the narrative usually breaks, because it resists drama. There is no climactic duel. No moment of redemption where the old skill suddenly proves supreme again. Instead, there is endurance, repetition, attrition, the slow replacement of romance with procedure. That is why Burma is harder to mythologize than Guadalcanal, and why it is more honest. Modern warfare does not erase heroism, it dilutes it. Individual actions still matter, but only insofar as they integrate cleanly into a larger system. Anything that creates friction, confusion, delay, asymmetry of pace becomes a liability regardless of how impressive it looks in isolation. The Winchester created friction. The Garand reduced it. George understood this not as theory, but as lived consequence. Every time his rifle fired, something else had to compensate. Extra movement, extra risk, extra coordination. That trade-off was invisible on Guadalcanal. In Burma, it was decisive. The final cruelty of adaptation is that it offers no credit for past success. The battlefield does not care that George had been right before. It only cares whether he is right now. That indifference is what makes systems powerful and individuals vulnerable. It is also what makes learning possible if ego does not intervene. George's later life reflects that internal shift. He did not build a public identity around being a sniper. He became an analyst, a teacher, a thinker. He moved away from the idea that excellence lives in moments and toward the idea that it lives in frameworks. That evolution mirrors the broader arc of 20th century conflict itself. The Winchester's silence in Burma is not an embarrassment. It is a signal flare, marking a historical transition. After that point, wars would increasingly be won by those who managed tempo, logistics, and coordination better, not by those who mastered a single decisive skill. Precision remained valuable, but only as one component among many. This is why the rifle belongs in a museum, and the lesson belongs in doctrine. Most people remember wars through artifacts. Few understand them through constraints. George did. He learned that the most dangerous thing you can carry into a changing environment is certainty. The second most dangerous is nostalgia. The stock trick is fascinating because it represents effort invested in the wrong variable. Weight mattered less than doctrine. Optimization mattered less than relevance. That mistake is common, and it repeats across history. People refine tools while ignoring systems. They improve performance while missing context. They win yesterday's fight perfectly and lose tomorrow's without understanding why. George escaped that trap. He did not cling to the idea that the battlefield owed him opportunity. He recognized that opportunity is created by alignment, not talent alone. When alignment disappears, insisting on talent becomes self-destructive. That is the final, quiet power of this story. It does not glorify adaptation as triumph. It shows adaptation as surrender of ego, of identity, of certainty. And it shows that surrender, paradoxically, as strength. The rifle killed men. The lesson outlived the rifle. In the end, John George did not lose relevance because the war changed. He retained relevance because he changed faster than his tools. That distinction is everything. The Winchester Model 70 stands still now, behind glass. George did not. That is why one is an artifact, and the other, a lesson. The story reaches its quiet conclusion not with a final shot, but with a recalibration of what victory even means. George did not leave Burma believing he had failed. He left understanding that success had changed its shape. Survival, cohesion, and momentum mattered more than individual contribution. That realization stripped war of its romance but gave it clarity. In earlier conflicts, excellence could dominate because battlefields paused long enough to recognize it. Burma never paused. It flowed. It absorbed. It erased sharp edges. In that kind of environment, sharpness was not an advantage, it was a vulnerability. Anything that demanded ideal conditions became fragile. Anything that functioned under stress became decisive. This is why the Garand did not need to be perfect. It needed to be adequate everywhere. Its genius was not in brilliance but in tolerance. It tolerated dirt. It tolerated fatigue. It tolerated bad decisions made by exhausted men at the edge of collapse. It tolerated reality. The Winchester did not. That is not an indictment. It is a classification. Tools are not moral entities. They are answers to specific questions. Guadalcanal asked one question. Burma asked another. George learned the cost of assuming the question would stay the same. This pattern repeats endlessly, far beyond war. Institutions collapse when they optimize for yesterday's constraints. Individuals stagnate when they mistake refinement for relevance. The most dangerous belief is not that you are good, it is that being good guarantees usefulness. George's restraint after the war is telling. He did not tour, boast, or mythologize. He documented. He analyzed. He taught. His authority did not come from insisting on his past success, but from explaining why it stopped mattering. That is the rarest form of credibility, the kind earned by admitting limits. In that sense, the Winchester's museum plaque misses the point. The rifle is not important because it killed men. It is important because it marks a boundary. Before it, wars could still be shaped by craftsmen. After it, wars belonged to systems. George stood astride that boundary long enough to see both sides clearly, and that clarity is uncomfortable. It tells us that effort does not entitle us to permanence, that mastery decays, that environments outgrow us without warning, that the reward for being excellent once is not future relevance but the burden of recognizing when to change. Most people fail that test. They argue, they resist, they insist the world is wrong. George did not. He adapted quietly, intellectually, and completely. That adaptation saved others even when it cost him the narrative of being exceptional. So the real ending of this story is not Burma or Guadalcanal or a rifle behind glass. It is a mindset, one that understands that survival belongs to those who can let go fastest, not of discipline or skill, but of certainty. The stock trick worked, then it didn't. That is not irony. That is reality. And the man who understood why it stopped working mattered far more than the weapon that once did. At some point, every system reveals what it truly values. Burma valued continuity over brilliance, redundancy over precision, recovery over perfection. George learned that the battlefield was no longer asking, asterisk, who can do this best? Asterisk. It was asking, asterisk, who can keep doing this longest? Asterisk. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. The Winchester belonged to a philosophy of decisive moments. One shot, one outcome. Burma belonged to a philosophy of sustained pressure. No moment mattered unless it could be repeated tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Precision that could not be repeated under exhaustion became noise in the accounting of war. This is why the rifle's silence is more important than its shots. Silence is data. It means the environment has stopped calling for what you offer. Many people mistake that silence for bad luck, bad timing, or temporary conditions. George did not. He understood that silence was the battlefield speaking clearly. There is also a brutal equality in this realization. Burma did not single George out. It treated everyone the same. Officers, veterans, newcomers. Malaria leveled them all. Terrain punished all feet equally. Hunger ignored rank. In that flattening, individual distinction lost operational meaning. War became arithmetic. And arithmetic is unforgiving. In arithmetic, volume beats elegance. Redundancy beats mastery. Systems beat stories. That does not mean skill disappears. It means skill must be embedded, not displayed. The Garand did not make heroes. It made platoons functional. It reduced the cognitive load on men who were already near collapse. It allowed them to react without thinking, to fire without planning, to survive without brilliance. That is the kind of weapon modern war selects for. George internalized this without resentment. He did not demand that Burma accommodate him. He adapted himself to Burma. That psychological flexibility is what separates survivors from casualties when environments shift faster than doctrine. Many soldiers returned from the war with medals and stories. George returned with a framework. He understood that what mattered most was not how well a man could perform under ideal conditions, but how little he degraded under terrible ones. That insight does not produce legends. It produces institutions. This is why his later influence outweighed his early kills. He helped reshape how officers thought about combat, not as a series of opportunities for excellence, but as a continuous problem of endurance. He taught them to ask different questions. Not, what is the best weapon? But what still works when everything goes wrong? The Winchester could not answer that question in Burma. The Garand could. And that is the final inversion of the story. The rifle that looked inferior on paper became decisive in practice. The rifle that looked exceptional became conditional. War exposed the difference between theoretical advantage and lived usefulness. That exposure is uncomfortable because it forces a reckoning with ego. It tells us that being exceptional is not enough, that improvement without reassessment is vanity, that optimization can become blindness if it ignores context. George saw that before the war ended, he did not cling to the image of himself as a sniper. He let that identity dissolve. That dissolution is not failure. It is evolution. The Winchester remains frozen in time, preserved as it was when it mattered. George did not freeze. He moved on, intellectually and professionally, carrying forward the lesson rather than the myth. And that is why this story lasts. Not because it celebrates a weapon, or a trick, or a kill count, but because it captures the exact moment when excellence meets change and chooses adaptation over nostalgia. Most never do. What makes this ending unsettling is that it offers no catharsis. There is no return to dominance, no final proof that the old way still mattered. Instead, there is acceptance, and acceptance rarely feels heroic. It feels like subtraction, like becoming smaller so that you can continue to exist inside a larger system. Burma forced that subtraction on everyone. Men were reduced to what they could still do while sick, hungry, and exhausted. Weapons were reduced to what still functioned when maintenance became impossible. Plans were reduced to what still worked when contact came sooner than expected. Everything ornamental was stripped away. That adjustment is rare. Most people wait too long. They demand one more chance, one more engagement, one more environment where their strength will matter again. By the time the proof arrives, it is usually too late. George did not wait. He learned from absence, from weeks of silence, from the fact that the battlefield never asked for his rifle anymore. That ability to read what is no longer being requested is more valuable than any skill that once was. It is also deeply uncomfortable, because it requires surrendering identity before it is forcibly taken. The Winchester did not betray George. Reality did not betray him either. Reality simply moved on. The betrayal only happens when someone refuses to follow. That is why the rifle's final lesson has nothing to do with marksmanship or weapons. It is about timing. Knowing when something has peaked. Knowing when further refinement is wasted effort. Knowing when the correct response is not improvement, but replacement. Most failures come from clinging, not incompetence. George did not cling. He did not argue that war should slow down for precision. He did not insist that the jungle should open sightlines. He accepted that the environment had voted, and that vote was final. That acceptance allowed him to remain useful, even when his defining skill no longer was. In the end, the Winchester Model 70 did exactly what it was supposed to do. It taught a lesson no range, no training course, and no doctrine could teach alone. It showed the limits of excellence. It demonstrated that being the best at something is meaningless if the world no longer needs that thing. The rifle is remembered because it killed men. George is remembered because he understood when killing stopped being the point. And that difference between doing something brilliantly and knowing when to stop doing it at all is the quiet dividing line between those who fade with their tools and those who survive change itself. There is an irony buried inside that distinction. Killing feels measurable. Adaptation does not. One leaves numbers. The other leaves outcomes that are harder to trace back to a single person. That is why history remembers weapons more easily than lessons, and why stories like this need to be told slowly, almost repetitively, to be understood. George's Winchester left a clean record. Dates, distances, confirmed kills. Burma left a blurred one. Miles marched, men evacuated, days endured. Yet it was Burma that decided the war's direction, not Guadalcanal. Attrition, logistics, and sustained pressure reshaped the Pacific more than any isolated act of marksmanship ever could. This is where the myth of the decisive individual finally collapses. Modern war does not eliminate individuals, it absorbs them. It turns them into components of momentum. Those who resist that absorption break. Those who accept it become invisible, but effective. George became invisible in the way modern systems require. He stopped trying to stand apart from the unit and focused on keeping it intact. He understood that leadership in Burma meant minimizing friction, not maximizing distinction. Every decision that reduced confusion, delay, or exposure mattered more than any potential shot he might one day take. That shift from expression to suppression of ego is why his later influence mattered. He taught officers not how to shine, but how not to fail. He emphasized weapons that forgave mistakes, doctrines that assumed exhaustion, and tactics that worked even when intelligence was incomplete. Those ideas sound unglamorous because they are. They are also what wins wars fought far from supply lines, under constant strain, against an enemy that refuses to stand still. The Winchester never jammed. It never malfunctioned. It never lied to him. But it asked too much from the environment. Modern war stopped making those promises. Once that happened, loyalty to the tool became a liability. George paid attention. He noticed that the war no longer paused for precision. He noticed that suppression, not elimination, decided movement. He noticed that speed mattered more than certainty. Those observations mattered more than any shot he ever fired. In the end, the Winchester's silence is not a failure. It is evidence. Evidence that the battlefield had moved on, and that those who survived would need to move with it. Most never do. That is why this story endures not as a celebration of a trick, or a weapon, or even a man, but as a record of a moment when excellence confronted change and chose to adapt instead of demanding relevance. The rifle stayed the same. The war did not. George understood that difference and lived. And that understanding carries one last consequence that is easy to miss. Adaptation does not feel like progress while you are doing it. It feels like loss. Loss of clarity. Loss of identity. Loss of the certainty that once guided every decision. George did not gain something obvious in Burma. He shed something familiar. That shedding is why most people resist change, even when evidence piles up. The Winchester still worked. It still killed. It still validated everything George believed about himself as a marksman. Letting go of its central role meant admitting that past success was no longer predictive, that admission is psychologically harder than learning any new skill. Burma demanded that admission daily. Every mile marched without firing reinforced the same message. The battlefield was no longer organized around moments of excellence. It was organized around continuity, around keeping men moving, around denying the enemy time rather than denying them life. The logic of the fight had shifted from elimination to disruption. In that logic, the best weapon was not the one that ended fights, it was the one that prevented them from escalating. The Garand did not need to win decisively. It needed to keep the platoon from being pinned, surrounded, or fixed in place. It needed to buy seconds, not victories. Seconds were enough. This reframes what effectiveness even means. The Winchester created certainty. The Garand created flexibility. One solved problems cleanly, the other prevented problems from becoming fatal. Modern war favors the second outcome almost every time. George's insight was recognizing that difference before it became fatal. He did not wait for catastrophe to prove the lesson. He read the environment. He watched what worked repeatedly and what worked only occasionally. He noticed which tools reduced risk across hundreds of small interactions rather than excelling in one perfect scenario. That is the kind of thinking that never looks heroic in the moment, but defines survival afterward. It also explains why Burma feels more modern than Guadalcanal. Most contemporary conflicts resemble Burma: fragmented, mobile, attritional, resistant to decisive moments. Precision still exists, but it lives inside systems rather than above them. Excellence matters only when it reduces systemic strain. This is why George's story refuses to resolve neatly. There is no final confirmation that the old way was wrong, only overwhelming evidence that it was no longer sufficient. The Winchester did not fail spectacularly. It faded. And fading is harder to recognize than collapse. Most people only adapt after collapse. George adapted during fade. That distinction is why the story matters. It captures the exact psychological pivot where a person stops asking, "How do I do this better?" and starts asking, "Is this still the right thing to do at all?" That question is rarer and more dangerous than ambition. The stock trick symbolizes the last attempt to preserve relevance through refinement. Lighter, faster, better. But refinement cannot outrun structural change. When the environment shifts, optimization becomes denial. George did not deny it. He accepted that his edge had an expiration date and that the expiration was not a personal failure but a contextual one. That acceptance allowed him to stay aligned with reality instead of fighting it. In the end, the lesson is brutally simple and endlessly uncomfortable. Being right once does not entitle you to remain right. Relevance must be re-earned continuously, not defended. The Winchester earned its place on Guadalcanal. It lost it in Burma. George earned his place in both not by insisting on past success, but by understanding when success had changed its definition. That is why the rifle is remembered as an artifact, and the lesson as a warning. And that warning does not end with war. It extends into every domain where conditions evolve faster than habits. What Burma exposed in combat is the same force that reshapes professions, institutions, and lives. Environments do not negotiate, they select. George survived because he treated the battlefield as an argument that could be lost. Most people treat success as proof that the argument is settled. That difference determines who adapts and who fossilizes. The Winchester was proof of concept. Burma was proof of constraint. One demonstrated what was possible. The other demonstrated what was sustainable. Between those two truths lies the real history of modern conflict and modern life. What makes this so difficult to internalize is that adaptation feels like abandonment of self. George had invested years becoming the man who could make that rifle lethal. Walking away from its centrality meant walking away from a version of himself that had been validated under fire. That is not strategic reasoning alone. That is grief. Burma demanded grief before it allowed survival. This is why adaptation is rare under pressure. People cling hardest to identity when identity feels threatened. The jungle did not just threaten George physically. It threatened the story that had made sense of his skill. Yet he chose coherence over comfort. He allowed his understanding of war to evolve even as his personal edge dulled. That choice separates learning from nostalgia. The modern battlefield in the modern world does not reward nostalgia. It punishes it quietly. It removes opportunity, reduces relevance, and waits. Those who notice early adapt. Those who don't insist louder until collapse makes the decision for them. George noticed early. He noticed that the war no longer paused to admire precision, that it no longer rewarded stillness, that it no longer allowed individuals to dominate tempo. He noticed that usefulness had shifted from excellence to reliability, from brilliance to endurance, from moments to systems. And instead of fighting that truth, he aligned with it. George's greatest strength was not marksmanship. It was interpretation. He read the environment accurately and updated his beliefs accordingly. That is the rarest battlefield skill of all. By the time he left Burma, the lesson was complete. Not written in reports or medals, but etched into miles marched and shots not fired. The war had taught him that relevance is provisional, that mastery expires, and that survival belongs to those who adjust before necessity becomes desperation. The rifle now rests behind glass. It cannot change. It cannot adapt. It cannot question whether it still belongs. George could and did. That is why his story matters. Not as a tale of a clever modification or a deadly streak, but as a record of the moment when excellence met reality and chose to evolve instead of insisting on permanence. In the end, the stock trick was never the point. The willingness to let it go was.